Hello and welcome. Thank you for coming along. Today we're going to look at recovering a looted past, repatriating African history through old artifacts, new digital technology, leading to new communities and new narratives in African history and culture. We'll start with old artifacts. Things like this, which are old prints, sketches, and engravings of things that were reported to be going on the African coast in the pre-colonial period. These sketches can now be digitized and analyzed in great detail among many cultural observers. So we'll start with the old artifacts, but we're going to apply digital technology in several different ways to expand our understanding of these old artifacts. And this will lead, very importantly, to new kinds of communities. New communities that are both international in scope and interdisciplinary in nature, in order to make sense of what we can now share from the digital technology. Now, the new communities are themselves going to give rise to new narratives, because people who come in with different perspectives generally have a different range of interpretations of the available old artifacts. So this is the dynamic we're going to pursue, and then think about, in effect, new ways to relate that to each other. By that we mean digital technology is not just good for replicating old things, but also for sharing them in new kinds of international environments made possible by digital technology. Zoom technology, for example, now makes it possible to hold international meetings around a set of documents or historical narratives that have previously been only the purview of a few limited groups. But now, new narratives lead to new global conversations in African history and culture. So this is what we're going to pursue for a few minutes here today. New narratives lead to new global conversations in African history and culture. Let's take a look then at some of the digitization technology that has launched new understandings of African history. On one level, it looks simple enough. We have old documents and old books. They abound in rare book libraries throughout Europe and the United States, and in other parts of the world as well, in the Middle East, in Arab cultures, and in other languages that we've not even begun to read. Now, things in those books are very interesting. We'll look at them in detail in a moment, but they can be mapped on top of other kinds of things now available only through digital technology, and that is satellite pictures of Earth that can now be viewed by anybody with a cell phone through Google Earth. So we're going to combine getting access to these things in print with that digital technology available from space. Now, obviously, one important new field in African history has been launched with a close digital examination of the historical texts and their printed maps. Many of these printed volumes from the 16th, even the 15th century, 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century had within them printed maps. And it's now possible to digitize those maps and share them around the world. This can start with individual travel accounts or encyclopedia and compilations like this one. These little books have fold-out maps, which are quite often several times the size of the book itself. The books have been studied for quite some time, but only recently have we developed the technology, the digital technology, to study the maps collaboratively. That is, across the world, across disciplines, across language traditions. We can now study these collaboratively in detail. It's possible to take a map from a book like that and georeference it to be placed on top of images taken of the Earth from satellites. There are hundreds of georeferenceable maps, printed maps, from the slave trade period, and these can be placed on top of images from space to make sense of where in West Africa things came and what was beneath these maps in geologic reality. If you georeference these maps and place them on top of things like rivers or forests or deserts, you can learn a great deal about what went on in African history and why it went on in particular places. It's possible to georeference and analyze maps of islands with even greater precision. And we can take maps from the 18th century, place them on top of georeferenced images from space, and learn a great deal, as we'll see. Scholarly research and teaching potential of this is enormous. Consider just one point on one map, for example. This is a map of a portion of the west coast of Africa, known then as the coast of Guinea, or later as the Gold Coast, and this French map is very revealing. We can zoom in on it at various levels and call up details just by focusing on a high digital resolution copy of the map. If you scan these maps in at 600 dots per inch, you can gain a great deal of knowledge just by being able to see things on a scale you couldn't even see if you had it in a map case in front of you or were displayed on the wall. For example, take a look at this. This map displays Dix Cove. It's a map in French, so it indicates that it's a Fort Anglais. And it's something we can learn about on several different levels. First, seeing it as a map, we can ask, well, where did the map come from? Well, in fact, it came from one of these 18th century books, in this case, a French book, which had a picture of a castle on the coast, an image that was drawn. It was not a photograph. It was long before photography existed, but the image was very, very instructive because, among other things, it has a picture of what are gardens right down next to the fort. It also has an indication of the floor plan of the fort, which, if you read the text in detail, will tell you where the slaves were stored, where the food was stored, and what was being, in effect, transacted in the trade from this particular fort of the English called Dix Cove. Well, that fort still exists, and you can see it's a substantial structure. It, in fact, is a massive structure and one of only approximately 80 forts and castles built along the coast of the current country of Ghana, what became known as the Gold Coast, as part of the slave trade. We can see it from space, as I've indicated, on these Google Earth explorations, and we can dive inside it and, in effect, take a look around, inspecting its architecture, its drainage system, its edifices from the outside, complete with their guns, pointed for the most part out to see. And then it's multi-level structures of dungeons and living spaces for the Europeans. The guns are pointed out to the sea for the simple reason that their biggest rivalry is not with the African powers, but with those who are coming to try to gain that same toehold for trade on the coast from the other European countries. So while the British may be in charge at this point of this very complex architecture and structure, which would have taken decades to build, they're not there uncontested. On the contrary, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese are all trying to unseat them and do so with regular military skirmishes. So these are military forts with an elaborate internal architecture and armaments to match. Armaments that have among them and on them indication of who forged them and for whom. In this case, King George, George Yarax, as it was symbolized in his insignia here. You see the G and the R indicating King George, the late 18th century king against whom the Americans were declaring their independence, George III, with all of his munitions pointed out to the sea. Other castles were even built on an earlier basis. In fact, this one came into existence, in fact, was started in 1482, and it represents the earliest standing European structure in sub-Saharan Africa. Others like this could be seen from the beach outside or from the oceans, and you can see how close they are to the ocean. This is the inside of Elmina. The Elmina fort was very important to the Portuguese. This one is the inside of Cape Coast Castle, and you'll see that that can be viewed from space as well, and a great deal can be learned about it. This is what the Africa Map Circle is starting to explore. So, with the digitization of maps and a new community of people called the Africa Map Circle that's starting to look at this, what kinds of new narratives might we expect? Well, we don't know for sure because it's just beginning, but it's worth looking into in detail. We can ask, who is the Africa Map Society and what do they do? A group of people internationally that have gotten together to share this kind of information and share their analyses of these maps. They're inspired in part by the work of Prosser Gifford, a professor of African history for a long time. He died recently in 2020, but he taught that our understanding of African history, in fact, all history, is shaped by two principal factors. First, the nature of the data we have available to interpret and discuss, and second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle to discuss it. Discuss the maps, discuss the documents, and the like. That's crucial. First, the nature of the data. Second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle, as he called it, in the circle to discuss it. That's a key concept. Who's in the circle? Well, the Africa Map Circle is trying to expand the circle beyond those who had access to rare book libraries or map collections of a specialized type to a much broader range of historians, scholars, students, and the general public. The Africa Map Circle seeks to be inclusive, whereas previous collections were by intention exclusive in the sense that you needed to preserve these maps, and that meant that they were kept from the public largely and only displayed in certain occasions and under very controlled conditions. But what is the circle? Well, let's take a look at it. The Africa Map Circle is a very interesting new intellectual enterprise because you could argue that the African continent was arguably the first one in the world to be mapped in its full outline. It was circumnavigated long before the Americas, or for Australia, for example, or certainly for Asia and large parts of the Russian north, the Siberian plains. But Africa maps were made largely and created by non-Africans. Now, this is an interesting anomaly. The first continent, you could call it that, to be fully encircled and mapped, but mapped by those who weren't from the continent by and large. Therefore, Africa maps can only be understood as multicultural documents from the beginning. What are the early maps? Well, in many cases, they're transcriptions of places and names for places that were used in the local language. In other cases, they're names applied from European traditions. But which European tradition? Well, it depends upon the European group making the map. So there's a hodgepodge of different names, sometimes referring to places, sometimes referring to kingdoms, sometimes referring to names of peoples or associations of peoples or federations of tribes. Other times referring to rather mundane things like salt pans and hard rock. These maps are multicultural to begin with, and they require international and multicultural teams of students and scholars to be analyzed adequately. They can't be understood from only one linguistic tradition, for example, nor can they be fully understood if we don't understand what a place name means in the local language. Digital technology now makes it possible to share and analyze these maps around the globe. This is what's new. The maps are old, but the technology is allowing us to do new things with them. The result is that the collaborative study of African maps can now provide a new paradigm for international and multicultural teaching and learning. This is very important because the techniques devised here are not just exclusive to Africa. They can be applied to any part of the globe with any linguistic tradition. The study of Chinese maps, for example, could be undertaken in the same way that we're studying now maps in the Africa Map Circle. Study of Arabic maps of Africa could be included in the same kind of scope, and with great results. Let's see what its intentions are. You might well ask, well, what is it? And you could scan the QR code and find out for yourself. How can it help me? How can it help those I know learn more or teach about Africa? Well, check it out. Scan the code and begin to participate, learn more, and join in. The goals of the Africa Map Circle are pretty simple and can be outlined very quickly. First, to provide readily available public access for scholars and students to historical and contemporary maps of Africa. Second, to provide for educators and students at all levels of teaching and learning resources to use in their own research and their development of online curricula, with selected examples provided from the Africa Map Circle's own Explorations series. And 3, to inspire and encourage scholars and students to expand and extend and share these tools in developing their own online African history research and teaching in Africa, the Americas, in Europe, Asia, and in fact, throughout the world. This is the kind of thing that could facilitate the Chinese study of Africa, the study of Arab countries along the northern part of Africa, and their understanding in their own cartographic tradition of sub-Saharan Africa, their understanding of the Indian Ocean and the role that African traders played in the Indian Ocean. All of these new extensible research areas can be absorbed in what the Africa Map Circle is beginning to undertake. In the future, the Africa Map Circle will seek to provide a platform upon which to share scholarly research and novel instruction initiatives that demonstrate a creative use of maps in online teaching and learning about Africa throughout the world. So, join up, join in. The Africa Map Circle is something for the public in general to learn from and learn about. Under lockdown, which we've all experienced for the last year and a half or so, this has become particularly important because learning under lockdown has changed from the very basic levels of elementary school right up through colleges, universities, and graduate school. Everyone's had to shelter in place and hunker down in a kind of new isolationism. Africa is a huge place, but we didn't learn much about it by going there during the last 18 months. Couldn't go there. Similarly, Africans couldn't come out from the continent and tell us, as they normally have, as exchange students throughout the Western world. That lockdown has meant there's been a kind of cutoff of the usual educational process. But we've devised new tools and developed some tips for online learning about Africa and the world during this lockdown. You can get in touch with some of these through the Africa Map Circle. At the African Studies Association last year, there was a special panel devoted to this. It's called Online Research and Teaching with Africa Maps, Tips, Techniques, Examples, and Resources. And it was put together by the Africa Map Circle, coordinated by them as one of the special sessions. It was highly successful, an international meeting, and in some sense it served as a proof of concept of what could lie in store for an even more ambitious effort. What can it do for students and scholars? Well, take a look at the online research and teaching that we managed to undertake during these lockdown times. Online research and teaching with African maps was a paper presented at the ASA meeting, and you can get access to it by clicking on the resources, scanning in the code, and clicking on the paper citation. So what we're looking at is bringing into a conversation with one another, not just old maps and digital technology, but new communities, plus new narratives in African and global history. How are we doing it? Well, largely through digital communications technology, not just the digitization of individual maps and the ability to send these by email or something like that, but the ability to explore them together with virtual seminar. This is what the African Studies meeting proved last year. We could hold a virtual international seminar with people from all over the world to take part in a Zoom session where things were shared online, real time with one another. Zoom technology is transforming all levels of education, and it's that technology that's being combined now with the digitization of African maps. Let's look at some of the 18th century maps then of the Gambia and Gorée Island area of West Africa. Here's one of the best known ones by a fellow named Leach, Captain John Leach. Developed a map in 1732 of the Gambia River, which was quite detailed. We can take a look at it and demonstrate for you how it can be accessed online and studied by yourselves if you have an internet connection, a cell phone, an iPad, or a computer with an internet connection. Let's take a look at this particular map and also the map of the plan of the island of Gorée, an island right off the coast of Senegal. So let's now take a look through the Africa Map Circle Digital Resources Directory, how we can look at some of these 18th century, 17th century, and 19th century maps of Africa and share them digitally across space and time. There are several libraries you can draw these things from, including the Library of Congress, New York Public Library, Stanford University Libraries, University of Illinois, Northwestern University, and a very valuable private collection entitled Afroterra. Their maps are perhaps the best organized in all of these different libraries. So let's take a look. We'll look for the map by Leach, a cartographer in the 18th century who made a map of the Gambia River that was very influential and quite detailed. So let's search the catalog for his name. Leach, Leach. Okay, we're going to hit go. And sure enough, 3 of the maps that are there are mentioned. One's in French, one's in English. Let's take the English one and take a look at it. If we hit on this, we'll see a small map indicated here in the little upper right-hand corner. Click for high resolution zoomable image is what it says. And sure enough, we can click that and get out to a zoomable image. And a zoomable image is one that will increase if you pinch it and spread it. That's what we'll do, to look at the mouth of the Gambia here and examine what this map records. First of all, let's look at the cartouche. And the cartouche indicates it's a map of the River Gambia from its mouth to Arapina by Captain John Leach, 1732. Now, the cartouche are not photographs. They're iconographic representations, often quite fanciful. Here, for example, we have no idea whether these bow and arrow representations with the person on the left represent real bows and real arrows that were in use at the time, or whether that's just the generic equipment for a native. This is important to focus on because often the images are generic images intended to convey a spirit or an indication of a general cultural type. And often the cultural types are quite wrong. We have no idea, for example, whether elephants existed anywhere near the Gambia at this point, yet they're pictured here in the cartouche. They probably weren't visible and in evidence near settlements in the Gambia. But other things are far more precise and give indications that are quite interesting. You can here see, for example, up these different rivers, indication of Batik, Kingstown, or various functional spots like salt pans. Salt pans over to the left and the right of these different rivulets that lead to the ocean, then an indication of broken islands, and then some annotations that are really quite interesting and very helpful, like this one. The towns marked with stars belong to the king of Barsali, and the other towns on the island to the king of Bara. These islands and parts adjoining make great quantities of salt and produce most part of the rice used at the factories, the land being low and proper for that grain. Now this is actually a very interesting piece of information. They're producing rice for the factories. What are the factories? Well, the factories are European establishments all along the rivers that are gaining slaves and stocking them in this offshore island known as James Island. You can see here's the different factories. Chili factory, Abreda factory, FACT, and they go on up the river. The numbers in the river indicate the fathoms, or the number times 6 is about the number of feet. Fathom is about 6 feet. And here you get an example of an indication of the company's corn house. Now, that means they're storing corn, what they call corn. It's not clear from the map or from the usage of the early 18th century what is meant by corn, except it now seems that it's Indian corn introduced from the Americas. Other portions of this part of West Africa show plantations of Indian corn that are being dried and used and reconstituted in the foodstuffs for the Atlantic trade. Many have focused on the role of James Island. You can't see much from this map because it's in effect so small here, but this is the English fort. It's taken over by the English, I should say, during the time of James I, the same King James, for which the King James Version of the Bible is named, by the way. In any case, these are the kinds of details you can pick up from these maps, and they're very valuable assets for looking in detail at what might be called the first draft of archaeology of this area, if we can undertake the archaeology eventually. Let's take a look at the island of Goree as well. Once again, we can go back to the directory in Afroterra and type in the island of Goree, or if we know the map location, as I do in this case, it's map number 1093, and we can go right to it. There too, it comes up in the right-hand upper column, square, and you can tap on that and get out to the zoomable map. The zoomable map is very, very detailed and interesting. It has an explanation. Although this is largely a French-dominated island, this map is in English, and the annotations are in English, giving an indication of what is where, all numbered, and an indication of what's supposed to be going on there, including the gardens, which are here, and an interesting set of huts up here, numbered 42 and 43, which are worth investigating in detail. Let's look now at the annotations for 42 and 43. Here they are. 42, convenient place for huts to lodge ye free Negroes. 43, huts of ye Bambaras. Now, what are the distinctions of those on the island between the Bambaras and the free Negroes? Very interesting that it should be outlined in a map like this, and something that should be studied in detail, along with the date that this takes place, indication of a slave booth, as well as where the troops are staying, and then an indication all along here of fortifications that haven't yet been built but are intended. Fortifications intended. Very interesting. The English are keeping close tabs on this island because they too would like to occupy it. Well, these are the kinds of detailed maps that you can look at and start posing questions more than answering them. These maps are not an answer to the questions we have, but they force us to ask some significant questions of the other documentation available. Well, you can see why we began to think of the use of these maps as taking a step toward an archaeology of the Atlantic slave trade, because these maps don't answer so many questions as they pose many, many more. They enable us to look at rivers, coastlines, and islands, and the long ocean voyage in a very different way than we were able to do so prior to access to these maps. And we can raise some troubling questions about how these ships, for example, were provisioned for hundreds of years to travel thousands of miles with millions of hungry passengers. Then we can ask the questions about the major structures left in Africa, constructed for the slave trade out of stone. These are in many cases named after kings. But as one poet put it later on in a very powerful poem, was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? This is the kind of question that can't help but be raised by the close study of these maps and the archaeology of the buildings left in the African coast. We're taking steps towards an archaeology of the Atlantic slave trade. Rosser Gifford, as you recall, emphasized that it was first the nature of the data we have available to us and discussed, and secondly, the range of people and perspectives that were included in the circle, as he called it, the circle which exchanged the information and posed the questions, and then tried to answer the questions. Now, the digital revolution has done two things, at least two things, in fact, many more, but it's made it possible to replicate these and distribute them, but it's also made it possible for new groups of people to get together in the circle to discuss them. That raised a whole series of questions that was put by the people who actually were never in the circle before. As you can see, the massive structures built in West Africa didn't build themselves. And often the history books are filled with statements like, the Swedish built this fort in 1650, or the Dutch built this fort in 1685. But anyone who takes a look at this on the ground and on the maps realizes that there are far too many to have ever been built by teams of Swedish workers coming down in boats to Africa, or boatloads of Dutch masons showing up to build a fortress. But no one asked that question. In fact, history books still record that the Dutch built this fort in such and such. Well, when you look at the perspective of these massive structures from the point of view of the workers, the poem by Bertolt Brecht is really very telling. Who built the seven gates of Thebes? As he points out in the second and third line, the books are filled with names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? Not quite. This is why who's in the circle to ask the questions about these maps is very important. Prasa Gifford's point is crucial. In addition to maps, it's possible now to study all historical images of Africa and the Africans themselves from a new vantage point. This is the goal of the African Historical Graphics Archive. One of their projects in the digital humanities is a project that's called Mapping the Slave Trade. This is a new kind of digital humanities projects. Many of the digital humanities focus on quantitative assessment of textual material. How many times is such and such a word used in a text, and does it indicate that Shakespeare wrote this play or somebody else wrote it? Well, that's a very useful form of digital humanities. But another form that's starting to emerge now is a close digital study of graphic material. Printed material in some cases, and if you can get the manuscript material that's at the origin of the printed material that must have existed prior to it, that's even more valuable. Beyond the area of the slave trade, the African Historical Graphics Archive intends to study graphic images of Africa from the 19th and 20th centuries, including drawings and photographs from Africa's pre-colonial and colonial history. Individuals sometimes loom large, probably larger in their imagination than in the history of Africa itself, but some of them, like Cecil Rhodes here, had ambitions to span the whole continent with a telegraph connection from Cape to Cairo. Others were noted in the photographic era, not the graphic era, but the photographic era, for their exploits as military and administrative figures in Africa. This becomes part of what needs to be examined in the African Historical Graphics Archive. In our day, the legacy of these images has triggered social activism, even among Rhodes Scholars in Oxford. Cecil Rhodes' statue stands as part of Oriel College and its facade on the High Street in Oxford. And some Rhodes Scholars have organized themselves to create a movement called Rhodes Must Fall, because they want the statues to be taken down. There are controversies within the Rhodes Scholar community about this, and the debates continue among the Rhodes Scholars themselves, which you can get access to digitally by scanning in the QR code and seeing what's being said. Many people are saying, in effect, Rhodes Must Fall is too small. The Rhodes Trust and Rhodes Scholars are looking at much bigger issues. And they've said it rather clearly in their internal publications and correspondence. In considering why Rhodes must fall, it would be unfortunate to become too distracted by statues alone. What good does it do to bring down a statue? As they point out, we need to look instead at the far more dangerous reification and permanent institutionalization of extractive industry and petrodependent agriculture that everywhere marks the enduring legacy of European imperialism throughout Africa and across the world, well beyond Cecil Rhodes's brief historical moment in southern Africa. He has become a kind of poster child for the ills of imperialism. But students would be naive to think that if you pull down statues of him, somehow you've accomplished something. If all of the legacy that he left is in place for extracting things like gold and diamond and valuable minerals and extracting agricultural surplus going to the rest of the world as a result of the legacy of colonial extractivism. So, recovering a looted past and repatriating African history has several components. Old artifacts can be studied with new digital technology, shared in such a way as to create new communities and new narratives. When that's extended with new forms of conversation through transnational and multinational Zoom technology, we can lead to new narratives that lead themselves to new global conversations in African history. Global conversations which can stimulate discussion about colonialism in general.